L'kutei Sichos Chelek Chaf, the Sicha for Parshas Vayera, Sicha Beis. Lilu Nishmas Rabbi Yosef Binyamin ben Rabbi Menashe Kaltman. We are also learning the Schus, our dear friend Yosef Shleima ben Risha, for a Refuah Shleima Ukreva. Sure, most of you are aware that this year, Tavshin Pei Hey, we are celebrating or marking 60 years since Tavshin Chaf Hey, when the Rebbe began teaching Rashi Sichos. The idea, where the Rebbe revolutionized how to look at a Rashi. The Rebbe taught klalim, rules, principles, and how to understand a Rashi. Today's Sikha is one of those very classic and very gishmake Rashi Sichos, where the Rebbe will go through one Rashi, line by line, ask a bunch of questions, and give us an answer, what's really bothering Rashi, and based on that, the whole Rashi will begin to make sense. And it's just very beautiful to see the classic Rashi Sikha. In Pasuk Vayoymar, Adonai imno motzasi chen beinecha al nosa avoyer me'al avdecha. This is when the three malachim dressed as humans came by on the third day of after Avram's Milah, Bris Milah, and he goes over to them and he says, "My lords, or my lord, if I find favor in your eyes, please do not pass by your servant. Stay with me." So Rashi quotes these words and he said, "My Lord, please." And Mefarish explains, "Legadol shebehem Omar." He's speaking to the greatest in stature amongst them. But he refers to all of them as my lords. So to the greatest one amongst them, he says, "Please don't leave." The kivan shelayavirhu, and if he won't leave, yamdu chaveirav imoy, his colleagues will remain with him. Ubeloshen zehu chayil, and in this understanding, the word Adonai has a mundane connotation. It doesn't mean Hashem; it means my Lord, as you would speak to another person. The Nashi is going to bring a second pirush, which we will get to in a moment. Is in dem nit verstandig. So let's stop for a moment on this first explanation of Rashi and say we don't understand something. As Avram had gesagt, Adna Adonai imno v'goymar nitzu alle drei anoshim nor b'leisum gadol shebehem. In the first part of this pirush, Rashi says he's speaking to the greatest in stature amongst them. He's not speaking to all three of them. He's speaking to one of them. So why does Rashi say he referred to all of them as my lords? Is he talking to the one or is he talking to the three? It seems these two parts of Rashi are contradictory. Beis, then the Rebbe continues the Rashi. Another explanation, Kaideshu. Then the word Adnai over here has a divine connotation. It means Hashem. And he was speaking to Hashem, asking him to wait for him until he'll run and welcome in the guests. And so that's what he said. Al nosaver me'al avdecha, please don't leave. I have to go invite the guests. Even though this pasuk is after the pasuk that told us previously that he ran towards them, so why was he telling now Hashem to wait while he goes to get them if he already went to get them? So the answer is, says Rashi, what he said to Hashem already happened. In other words, the psukim are not in the order of the events, but it happened in that order. The first he said to Hashem, please, please wait a moment while I go get the guests, and then he went to get the guests. But and it is common in the psukim to be structured like this. As Rashi explained on the pasuk, where the Eibishter is saying that he's not going to get upset anymore at the people. He realizes b'shagamu basar that people are humans. And the pasuk over there ends, V'hayu yamav me'avesrim shana. So says Rashi, I'm going to give them 120 years, and if they don't do tshuva, I'm going to bring a mabul. So Rashi says over there, Shenichtiv achar vayeled neach. V'iev shaleimar elim kein koidim gzeres kuv chav shana. The pasuk liyadin nuchi ba'adam is being said 120 years before the mabul. saying, I'm going to give them 120 years, and if not, they don't do tshuva, I'm going to bring a mabul. Now, we already learned Vayera Noach, that Noach had children. Noach's children were born 100 years before the mabul. So how could it be that we already learned about the birth of Noach's children, and now we're holding it 120 years before the mabul? Says Rashi, in muktumum ucher b'Torah, that not necessarily are the psukim written in Torah in chronological order. And it could be that Hashem said at one point, I'm going to bring a mabul in 120 years, and later Noach had children, and yet in the psukim it's written in the opposite order. Similarly, in our parsha here, where it says first Vayera the Krasam, but what actually happened is that first Avram said to Hashem, according to this Pirush Rashi, please wait for me while I go get my guests, and then he ran towards them to Vayera the Krasam to invite them in. Darfon verstehen. So now the Rebbe is going to ask a number of questions on the theme of why do we need two Pirushim. Darfon verstehen. Für was darf Rashi sagen zwei Pirushim und ist sich nicht mistabek mit einem? Number one, why does Rashi not suffice with one explanation? Why does he need to introduce two? As we have learned in the past, if Rashi brings two Pirushim, it means that each one is lacking something, which is why he had to bring another one to complement what was missing. So the question is, what's missing in each of the Pirushim that Rashi needs to bring two? Base, for was kommt der Pirush hu choil als erster iker diker Pirush und der Pirush koidish als zweiter. We know that whichever Pirush, when Rashi brings two Pirushim, in whichever one he places first, that's the one that he sees as the primary Pirush. And the second one is secondary. So the question is, why is the Pirush that over here the word Adnai has a mundane connotation? Why is that first, implying that Rashi sees that as the primary Pirush, and why is the other one second? Nochmer, additionally, since in most places the term Adnai has a divine connotation, that would imply that if you're going to say, as Rashi does here, that Adnai over here has a mundane connotation, as a Taish von Wort Adnai da is anders, which means that here it's being translated different than in most other places. Is weiter from Psuti Shel Mikra. Wieder Pirush Kaidushu. That would mean that the Pirush, that this is of mundane connotation, is further from the basic understanding of the word Adnai, which normally means that has a divine connotation. We know that. How does Rashi decide which is the primary Pirush? The one that is more consistent with Psuti Shel Mikra. So usually Adnai means Hashem. So if you're going to say that over here it means Shel Choil, it means to people, then that's further from Psuti Shel Mikra and should have been second. And yet Rashi chooses that one to go first, and the one of Shel Kodesh, that Adnai here means Hashem, he places second. The third question that we ask over here is, as das is Chel, sagt Rashi in ersten Pirush b'siyum devarov. In the first Pirush, when Rashi says that the word Adnai means mundane, Rashi puts that at the end of the first Pirush. Una das is Kodesh, sagt in zweiten Pirush gleich mit Chilas Pirushei. And in the second Pirush of Rashi, where he says that Kodesh means Hashem, Rashi brings right in the beginning of the second Pirush. Thus is der Tamashinui. Why? What is the explanation? Why the discussion whether it's Kodesh or Choil in the first Pirush is brought at the end, and in the second Pirush is brought at the beginning. Sif Gimel. Noch then we're still in the Rashi, still learning the Rashi and dissecting it. Nachdem wie Rashi verendigt beide Pirushim, after Rashi concludes both explanations, either that he was talking the Gadol Shebahem, and Adnai here means my Lord, as you would say it to a person, or the second Pirush that he was talking to Hashem, and Adnai over here means Hashem. Rashi adds that both of these explanations are brought in Bereshis Rabbah. He's in Demnit Muvan, and on this alone we have three questions. Why does Rashi have to bring the source, which he in most cases does not do at all? Then Rashi brings zwei Pirushim. when we do find a case where Rashi brings two Pirushim, and Rashi feels the need to inform us that both of these Pirushim originate from the teachings of Chazal, he usually mentions that in the beginning. He'll start and say, the Medrash tells us two Pirushim, one like this, one like that. But Rashi, if he does, he usually puts it in the beginning. So here too, he should have begun the Rashi with it. It states in Bereshis Rabbah v'kadoimo or something like that, and not at the end. Why does Rashi only bring the source at the end? So the question of Aleph was, why does Rashi have to bring a source? Question basis, if he does need to bring a source, why not bring it when he does bring a source? He usually brings it in the beginning. Gimel. In Bereshis Rabbah Shelafanenu, in our version of Bereshis Rabbah, is done on Ein Pirush. And thus is a lashon shel chel. It only brings one of these Rashi's explanations. The first one, which is that Adnai is a lashon chel, has a mundane connotation, and Avram was talking to the guests. So our Bereshis Rabbah has only one pirush. Muzman onemin. We therefore must accept, as in the Nusach from Bereshis Rabbah was Rashi had gehabt, when gebracht bei die Pirushim, that Rashi had a different version, which had two explanations. Rashi sagt, ushtei al shenes of Bereshis Rabbah, as Rashi says clearly, that both of these explanations are Bereshis Rabbah. So that's okay. In other words, the fact that our Bereshis Rabbah is not the same, obviously Rashi had a different version. But this does raise a question. In Masechta Shvuos, when gebracht bei die Pirushim, in the Gemara Masechta Shvuos, it brings both Pirushim. And there aren't multiple versions. The Bereshis Rabbah has a version that we have that only has one pirush. You have the version of Rashi that there was two pirushim. But the Gemara Shvuos is much easier. There's no multiple versions. Everyone agrees that there were two pirushim in the Gemara. Tofar vos is Rashi mitzayin as the makir from Beida pirushim is Bereshis Rabbah. So why does Rashi reference the source from Bereshis Rabbah, but das is not like ein Girsa Bereshis Rabbah, which only is consistent with one version, und dazu nicht die Girsa Ravachas, and not the accepted version, und bringt nicht die Gemara in Shvuos, and doesn't bring the Gemara in Shvuos, which everyone agrees has the two pirushim. Why would Rashi lean on Bereshis Rabbah? It's questionable. What the Bereshis, not questionable, but it's arguable. What is included in the Bereshis Rabbah? Well, you could have brought the Gemara where everyone agrees what the Gemara says. So very quickly, if you go through the whole Rashi, our first question is, why does Rashi say that he's talking to the Gadol Shebahem, to the greatest one amongst them, and yet say that he called them all Adoinim, my lords? Why do we need two Pirushim? Why does the first Pirush come first and the second Pirush come second? Especially since the fact that Adonai means Hashem should have been first, because that's the more common understanding. Why does Rashi address the Chol versus Kodesh aspect in the first Pirush at the end, in the second Pirush at the beginning? The other questions that we had is, why does Rashi bring a source? If he does bring a source, why at the end? And why does he use Bereshis Rabbah as his source and not the Gemara in Masechta Shvuos, which is not embroiled in any disagreements? See if Dalid, the Rebbe is going to begin the beer, and as the Rebbe so often does, the Rebbe goes back to what is really bothering Rashi. Once we understand what's bothering Rashi, we'll understand what these two Pirushim are coming to tell us, to answer, and based on that, we'll understand why Rashi says what he says, and why he places it in this order. All of our questions will become will be answered, and the whole Rashi will fit in perfectly like a puzzle. Der beer b'chozeh. Noch vayoymar ad doinoi im no matzasi chein v'gomer me'alavdecha. After the pasuk says, the pasuk that we're discussing, that Avram said, "My Lord or my lords, if I only have found favor in your eyes, please don't go." Steht gleich in the psukim slacher, immediately in the next psukim, als hemshich von Avram's reid, as a continuation to Avram's speech. Yukach no ma'at mayim, let us bring some water, v'rachatzu raglechem, and you'll wash your feet. V'ekcho pas lechem, I will go get some bread, v'sa'adu libchem, and you'll have a meal. Uvibal das far yukach no. Steht nit noch einmal vayomer, and since in the psukim, it doesn't say again vayomer, and Avram said, let us go get water. Is verstandig, and das als hat Avram gesagt in ein Amira. So obviously, it's all part of the same monologue. Avram started Vayoymar. He said, Adonai, im no matzasi chein beinecha, etc. Yukach no mat mayim, etc. It's all under the same Vayoymar. It's all part of the same monologue. And when Avram says, please don't leave, it's as a continuation to, I'm going to bring you water, I'll wash your feet, I'll bring you bread, you'll eat something. He just starts out and saying, please don't go, I'll take good care of you. And since obviously the fact that he's going to bring water, they can wash their feet, was certainly said to the three guests. So the Ben Chamis Lemikra, the 5-year-old, the mythical 5-year-old that to whom Rashi is talking to, understands very simply as Eichti as Chalas Amira Adnai Im Navegaimar is gesagt worden nicht zum Ebersten. If Yukach Namat Maim is being spoken to the three guests, then so too Im Namatzasi Chaim Beinach is also being spoken to the three guests, because it's all part of the same Vayomer, it's all part of the same monologue. And therefore Rashi does not have to immediately address the fact and say, by the way, the word Adnai here has a mundane connotation. Because the student of the Chumash understands it on his own. As soon as he sees that Avram is saying the words Adnai, to the same person or people that he's saying Yukach Namat Mayim, clearly he's not talking to the Eibishter, he's talking to the people, to the guests. So the question that's bothering Rashi that we're about to learn is based on this foundation, that the youngest student who's learning these psukim automatically knows by looking at the fact that there's no extra word vayomer that Avram is talking to his guests. So on that, this raises a question. If he's speaking to his three guests, why is he speaking to them in the single tense? If I find favor in your eyes and not be'einechem, al no saver, please don't pass, not savru, me'al avodecha, from your servant, not avdechem. In English, your is both single and plural. But in Hebrew, in Lashon Kodesh, it would have been different. You see clearly, afterwards, Yukach Namat Mayim v'rachatzurak lechem, v'sadu libchem, is all in Lashon Rabim. But in this pasuk, all of a sudden, it's Lashon Yachid. That's what's bothering Rashi. Why, if it's clear, as we just made it, as we just explained, that Avram is talking to his guests, and there's three of them, why does the pasuk speak in Lashon Yachid? So therefore Rashi addresses this. He's speaking to the most important among them. As does der gesagt nur zu einem, he was speaking to one of them, zum Gadol Shabbat, to the greatest in stature, und der Vater hat gesagt b'lashon yachid, and therefore he says b'lashon yachid. So that's the first thing that Rashi says. The Gadol Shabbat is talking to one person, to the greatest among them. Oh, but if he's so immediately you're going to ask, if there's three people over here, it's not proper etiquette to only give attention to one of them, to only turn to one of them. Even if he's the greatest among them, to ignore the other two as if they don't exist is not proper manners. So why is Avram speaking only to one of them, albeit the greatest of them? But why just to one? And therefore Rashi adds that he referred to all of them as my lords. As the words of Rashi, Legadol Shabam Amar, when he started speaking his words and he said, please don't leave, he spoke to the greatest one. But the attention that he gave, Kram, he referred to them, mitten Teyar Adnai, Farin Zagin Imna, before he says, please don't leave, he refers to all of them as my lords. In that part, he was talking to all three of them. Kram, Kulam Adainim, he referred to all of them as my lords, my masters. So it makes sense that when you're speaking, you can speak to one person, and you don't have to speak to everyone, but at least you have to acknowledge them. So therefore Rashi says, Legadol Shem Amar, when it came to the statement, it was made to the one of them. But before that, he acknowledged all of them. He said, hello, sirs, thank you for coming. and then he turns, I'm adding in words over here, but he said, Adnai, my lords, and then he turns to the Gadol Shebhem and he says, even though it's Azichem Beinacha. Okay. Move on. But there's still something that's not fully understood. He wanted all three of them to remain as guests. So why did he speak just to one of them? He should have told them all to stay. Rashi continues, so to the greatest amongst them, he said, don't leave. And if he won't leave, then his colleagues will certainly stay with him. As that by saying to the greatest amongst them, please don't leave, with that he addressed the fact and he made sure that the others shouldn't leave either. So this is what Rashi is telling us. Rashi basically there's three steps here. Number one, why is it Lashon Yachid? Because he's talking only to one of them. Why is he ignoring the other two? He's not. He called them all Adoinim. And why did he only say to one of them to stay? Because he knew that if the greatest one will stay, the others will stay as well. In Sifei, the Rebbe is going to say that there's one last detail that's not fully understood, which is the reason why Rashi feels that he needs to bring another pirush. After all this, it's something that's still not fully understood. Why did Avram have to influence them to stay by asking the greatest amongst them to stay? He could have spoken to all three of them, please don't leave. And even though asking them to stay really has no benefit, because regardless, they're going to follow their leader, von deswegen, nevertheless, there still is some benefit. Because it could be understood that if he tells just the greatest amongst them that he should stay, then maybe he meant him and not the others. So he should have included the other two and said to all of them, please don't leave. In other words, Rashi tells us what happened. That he spoke to the Gadol Shebhem. He also addressed all of them by saying Adnai. He called them all Adoinim. And he did want them all to stay. And that's why he spoke to the Gadol Shebhem, hoping that they would follow the lead of their leader. But the question remains, why couldn't he just be direct and clear and tell everyone, guys, please stay with me? And because this question does not have an answer, therefore Rashi has to bring a second pirush. That the word Adna here has a divine connotation. And he's asking Hashem to stay while he gets his guest. As the Amira Adna, that the words Hashem, it wasn't to the three guests as a introduction, as a preface to the fact that he's going to offer them water to wash their feet. Avram says it Lashon Yachid because he's talking to Hashem. Hashem should wait for him until he runs in. When he welcomes in the guests. So that's the second pirush. Because Rashi is still bothered, you're telling me it says with Lashon Yachid speaking to the Gadol Shebhem. Why not speak to all three of them? And therefore Rashi says there's a second pirush that Lashon Yachid because he's speaking to Hashem. Ober in Sivav, the Rebbe is going to explain for three reasons why this second pirush that he's talking to Hashem is even more questionable, and therefore it comes second. Ober then pirush bring Rashi out zweiter pirush, but this pirush that he's talking to Hashem, Rashi brings as the second pirush. Das ist weniger masim zu Pshuto Shel Mikra. It is more inconsistent or less consistent with Pshuto Shel Mikra than the first pirush. Weil for the following three reasons. Aleph. Von dem was far Yukach neu steht doch mal Vayera. Is mashma kenal siv dalid as Vayera Adnai gamer on the Savar. The same thing that we explained, that we said in the beginning of the beer. In the beginning of the beer, it says it's very hard to say that he's talking to Hashem. We wanted to say he's talking to Hashem because Adna usually means Kodesh. But there's no second Vayomer. So the first Vayomer has to be to the same people that he's saying Yukach no matmayim. So to say that the first pasuk is to Hashem and the rest of the psukim are to the Malachim is difficult to say. Base, Says nit mistaber zu sagen, as beshas der Eibishter is given by Avram, doesn't logically make sense to say that when Hashem was visiting by Avram, so Avram leifen zu der Erchim und verlassen dem Eibishter. Then Avram would run to the guests and leave Hashem behind. And certainly noch beten bei mir, soll warten auf him, ask Hashem, oh please wait for me while I go get my guests. Now you might wonder, everyone knows that we learn from this how important Achanos HaSarchim is, that Avram ran to the guests and left Hashem behind. So Rabbi addresses that in Ha'ara 20, and he says even though the Gemara in Shabbos learns a whole limud out of this, but that's not Pshudah Shal Mikra. Rashi doesn't mention it. That Rashi doesn't say that from this we learn because Al Pi Pshudah Shal Mikra is very difficult to say that Avram would leave Hashem behind and go tend to his guests. So that's point number 2. Point number 1 is that there's a missing, that there's no extra vayomer here to separate that there was 2 separate discussions. Second of all, it doesn't make sense really Al Pi Pshudah Shal Mikra to say that Avram would leave Hashem behind to go take care of his guests. And a third point, very geschmack in the kuda here. As soon as the malachim came, which are basically these 3 men, were the malachim, as we know. And one of these malachim, his job was to heal Avram. We must say that Avram was immediately healed, even before he welcomed in the guests. Because if the refuah is coming from a malach, it doesn't have to take time. When you go to the doctor, there's a process. The medicine has to kick in and has to do a procedure. But if the refuah is coming from the malach, then it happens in an instant. This is the whole purpose of Hashem's visit, was to visit the sick. That would mean as nachin onkumen von the malachim urefuah. That once the malachim arrived and Avram was healed, there was no reason anymore that Hashem should be visiting him. Why would he ask Hashem to wait and don't go away if the whole reason he came was for Bikur Chaylim and he's not a Chayla anymore? So for these 3 reasons, when the Rebbe had Rashi gestellt den Pirus, and because of these 3 reasons, Rashi takes this Pirus that Avram was speaking to Hashem and puts it as the second, namely the secondary explanation. Because according to the second explanation, there are more and more severe questions than we had on the first Pirush, which just was, why did he talk to 1 and not to 3? But on the second Pirush, we have 3 questions. How does it fit that Avram was having 2 separate conversations under the same word Vayomer? How does it fit that Avram would run away from Hashem to go tend to his guests? And why would Avram even ask him to stay if he was already healed? So therefore, Rashi puts this one second, which means that even though usually the name Adnai means Lashon Kodesh, usually has a divine connotation, the fact that here it's Lashon Choil is actually closer to Pshudah Shal Mikra. As we explained, that because it only says 1 Vayomer, it makes more sense to say that Avram is talking to the Anashim, to the guests, to the Malachim, and not to Hashem. And based on that, we'll understand why Rashi mentions the fact that it's Shel Choil at the end of Pirush 1, and mentions the fact that it's Shel Kodesh at the beginning of Pirush 2. Wenn verstandig was beloschen Shel Choil, sagt Rashi beim Siyum von ersten Pirush. Und Kodesh sagt gleich beim Mann von zweiten Pirush. Weil if looking at the context, at the basic understanding of the psukim, it's clear that the Vayomer or Vayoymar is to the 3 guests. Und der Rebbe is the next Pirush with the Chiddush is nor das was legadol shebem Amar. So in the first Pirush, the fact that he's talking to the people, that's not to Hashem, that's not the Chiddush. That's obvious from the pasuk. What's the Chiddush of Rashi? That he's talking to the gadol shebem, to only one of them. So therefore Rashi doesn't begin by saying that this word Adna here has a mundane connotation. Well, because that's not what's unique about Rashi's explanation. That I already know from the pasuk. So Rashi starts with the Gadol Amar. That's the Chiddush of Rashi, that he's speaking to one person and not the 3 people. And therefore Rashi starts with that. So in that case, why mention anything? If I know already from the Psukim, then why does Rashi have to say V'loshen zeh shel chayil? Nor hayesvis is fart nit as a glatik. As men soll nutzen dem tear adnai of a mensch. It's not so understood to use the term Adnai, which usually speaks to Hashem, to use it on a human being. Therefore, at the end, once he already gave us the Chiddush and gave us the main details of the Pirush, he says at the very end, as Adnai does, that the term Adnai here is taka an exception. This is exception to the rule. That even though usually it means Shel Kodesh, here it's Shel Chayil. But that's not the main part of the Pirush. The main part of the Pirush is that he's talking Legadol Shabbat. That's why that comes first. Whereas when it comes to the second Pirush, Rashi begins with the fact that over here Adnai has a divine connotation. Weil Aleph, to sagen as Adnai da is Kodesh is a Chiddush. Because to say that Adnai over here means Hashem, that is a novel way of looking at it. Even though usually Adnai means Kodesh, but to say it here is taka a Chiddush. The Rebbe repeated numerous times in the Sikha already that because of the one Vayomer, it makes the most sense that Avram is talking to the people and not to Hashem. So to say that it's talking to Hashem is a Chiddush. Rashi always begins, not always, but in this Rashi, Rashi's beginning with the Chiddush. The Chiddush is Shel Kodesh. Beis, there's another point. When you say some Pirush, the proof and the foundation of the fact that Rashi is going to say that he was speaking to Hashem, not as is understood more basically, that he was talking to the people. Is Kinal was late and Pirush is glatik dot Taishon Adnai. The only reason why I would consider to say that he's talking to Hashem, because that would satisfy the fact that we're teaching Adnai as we usually do, meaning Hashem, da punkt v'umetum, as we normally do. In other words, why would I say here that he's speaking to Hashem? Even though there are these various questions on that. Because at least it satisfies us that the Adnai here means, as it usually does, Hashem. So the whole foundation of the fact that Hashem, that Avram is talking to Hashem is so that way the fact that Adnai Lashon Kodesh is a Lashon of Kodesh works. That's why Rashi begins with this detail that here Adnai has a divine connotation to madgish sein as in dem basteti yechachat zum sein Baruch Hu, to highlight the fact that this is our proof, this is our foundation to say that he was talking to Hashem. In other words, the fact that it's Kodesh, A, it's a Chiddush, and Rashi starting with a Chiddush. B, it's the foundation of the whole Pirush. Therefore, Rashi has to bring that in first in order to be able to build on that he was talking to Hashem and telling him not to leave. So now, all we have to answer now, the questions that the Rebbe asked in the Sikha, is about the reference to Bereishis Rabbah. Why do we need a reference? Why does the reference come at the end? And why does Rashi reference Bereishis Rabbah and not the Gemara in Masechta Shavuos? But now, the way we got here, what we have to conclude is that whether you say he's talking Legadol Shebehem and not to the other two, or whether you say that he's talking to Hashem and not to the people, it doesn't fit perfectly into Psutei Shel Mikra. Either way, it doesn't fit perfectly. Wie bald das beide Pirushim seine nit glatik, nur euch weit von dem reinem Pshat. Since both Pirushim, not only are they not so smooth that there's questions on them, but they're far from pure Pshat. To say that Avram was talking to one person, not to the other two, you have to say that because of the build-up. He's talking obviously to the people, but it's Lashon Yachid, so you have no choice. So you have to say that he's talking to one of them. Or to say that he's talking to Hashem, even though there's a lack of another Vayomer. It basically doesn't fit in well. It can't say this is pure Pshat. In other words, if it's pure Pshat, then Rashi doesn't have to bring a source. Rashi just says this is the Pshat. But because both of these Pirushim that Rashi brought are not pure Pshat, therefore Rashi says both of these explanations come from Bereishis Rabbah. As the Mocker from Beiti Pirushim is in Medrash, that the source of both Pirushim is from the Medrash, which Medrash is not consistent or so consistent with Traditional Mikra. Why is he bringing it in that case? If it says Aber Azad Rash versus Beloshin Rashi Agada Meisheves Divrei HaMikra. Previously, Rashi already told us that when there's Agada, when there's a Drash, Drash is a homiletic interpretation, but one that helps us understand the pshat of the pasuk. Rashi will bring it. If there's a question in pshat that cannot be satisfied without using drash, Rashi will bring the drash because it's miyasheves divrei hamikra. So Rashi says, I know you're bothered by the fact that it's not, it's weit von reine pshat, it's far from pure pshat. So I'll tell you, you're right, it's taka a drash, but it's a drash, hamiyasheves is divrei hamikra, and therefore I'm bringing it. Und der Pfarrer sagt, Rashi und Stehl, das Sinn ist, wenn es aber in Zion von seinem Pirush. This is why Rashi brings it at the end. Weil erst la'achri, wie man lernt durch beide Pirushim, man versteht, dass es eine weit von der Neinem Pshat, only after you've learned through both Pirushim, and you realize how difficult they are to fit into pure Pshat, erst dann davon ankommen zu der Bewahrnis, dass es eine mit der Genommen von Medrash. At that point, Rashi has to clarify that it comes from Medrash. And that's why it's okay that it doesn't fit into Pshat. So that answers two of our questions. Why did Rashi bring a source? Because since it's not pshat, so Rashi has to say where this is coming from. But that question only, or that realization only comes up at the end of the Rashi, and that's why that's where Rashi brings the source of Bereishis Rabba. This also explains why Rashi references the Medrash and not the Gemara. Weil Davke durch mit sein zu Bereishis Rabba Medrash is mudgish as beide Perushim sein and Agada. Only by referencing the Medrash does it make the point that both of these Perushim are homiletic and not literal. Whereas in Gemara, many of the things that are learned from Sukkim are also consistent with Pshat. So if Rashi said that the source was in Sechta Shvuos, you would think that he's saying that this is the pshat of the pasuk, and you say, how is this the pshat of the pasuk? It doesn't fit in well with the pasuk. Therefore, Rashi specifically points to the Bereishis Rabba to tell us that it is agada, that it's a homiletic, it's not literal, but Hayes is the only way to teach the pasuk. Rashi brings it, but with an acknowledgement that it's agada or drash and not reine pshat. And while there's no Yena Shalteira and no Hira here, which obviously this is something that the learner of the Sikha has to do on their own in this case, but what it does do is it goes through Kimat the entire Rashi. Rabbi didn't really address the part about the Eimuk to Muchar Matera. Rabbi didn't address it at all. But the first shot, the second shot, why do we need two Pirushim? Why in this order? Why the reference to Bereishis Rabba? All of these details and all the questions are answered as they look so beautiful once you understand what's bothering Rashi and what Rashi is trying to do.